Now that we've had a good overview on the erythrocytes, let's take a look at the next formed element in blood, which is leukocytes, that I'm going to talk about, or white blood cells. We're going to learn about the 5 different types of white blood cells and, generally speaking, the kinds of roles each of them plays in the body. So you'll remember that we have 5 main different types of leukocytes, and we can divide those 5 main types out into those that are granulocytes, or having a grainy appearance to the cytoplasm, and those that are agranulocytes, those that do not. And the granulocytes include neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. The agranulocytes, by definition, are the monocytes and the lymphocytes. I'm going to go through all of these leukocytes in order of how common they are in the blood. So we're going to start with neutrophils. They account for 60 to 70% of all leukocytes found in the blood. Neutrophils are these guys down here. They have a multi-lobed nucleus. See how their nucleus is not a nice circle, but rather kind of this lobe structure with little filaments or segments connecting the lobes. And they tend to have a cytoplasm that, when it is stained, comes out to be sort of a violet color. The reason for that is we use 2 different types of stain to stain red blood cells so that we can see them under the microscope nicely. We use one stain that's an acidic-based stain, and it normally stains things that attract this acidic stain will stain red. We also use a basic stain, a stain that things that have a basic pH to them will be attracted to, and that basic stain stains things blue. Neutrophils have sort of a overall neutral pH, thus the term neutrophil. Thus they take up about an equal amount of the red acidic stain and the blue basic stain we use. Red and blue together make kind of a purplish violet color, and that's why neutrophils have that particular color to their cytoplasm. Okay, the role of neutrophils, by far and away, their number one role in the red blood or in the blood is to consume bacteria. And they often will exit out of the blood, they'll enter into tissues, and there they will consume up bacteria that maybe were introduced because you, I don't know, cut yourself with a knife in the kitchen, or you got a sliver, or whatever it is. Neutrophils are good at consuming about somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 to 24 bacteria. About a couple dozen bacteria is about the maximum number that they can consume, and then they've reached their max and they'll die. But very good for responding to bacterial infection. The next most common type of leukocyte are the lymphocytes. We're going to learn when we get to the immune system that there are 2 subtypes of lymphocytes. Some are called B cells, others are called T cells. The lymphocytes are really good for responding to viral infections, and they're also really good at killing off precancerous and cancerous cells in the body. And one of the 2 types of lymphocytes, the B cells, are also really good at making antibodies. Again, when we learn about the immune system, we'll get into more detail with that. Under a microscope, lymphocytes have a relatively clear cytoplasm. The way I pick them out under a microscope is if I see a white blood cell, if I'm wondering if it's a lymphocyte, I look to see is it mostly nucleus with just a tiny little ring of cytoplasm around it. If it's mostly nucleus and a really tiny little ring of cytoplasm, I know it's a lymphocyte. These guys account for roughly about 1/4 to 1/3 of the total number of white blood cells present in blood. When we go to the next most common type, monocytes, the percentage drops way down. Now we're into the 3 to 8% category. Monocytes are the largest of the leukocytes, and they have a characteristic kidney bean-shaped nucleus and a relatively clear cytoplasm that doesn't take up any stain. Monocytes only stay in the blood for a couple days at most, and then they migrate out of the blood into the surrounding connective tissue, and they remain there for the duration of their life. And the duration of their life can be as long as a decade or more. When they migrate out of the blood and into the tissues, they transform, they change in appearance, and they go from being called a monocyte to being called a macrophage. Phage means to eat, macro means large. So these are large cells that eat things. And their number one most important responsibility is to consume bacteria. But whereas neutrophils only can consume a couple dozen bacteria and then they call it quits, macrophages have the ability to consume upwards of 100 bacterial cells before they die. They can also consume the dead and dying neutrophils. They can consume bacteria, viral particles, cellular debris. They're sort of like the garbage man of the connective tissue of the body. They go around and do lots of cleanup of lots of different types of debris, whether it's pathogenic or cellular in nature. Next up are the two least common types of leukocytes. These are the eosinophils and the basophils. Eosinophils tend to have an acidic pH to their cytoplasm. Therefore, they tend to take up that reddish eosin dye that has a red color to it. And thus, when we look at them under a microscope, their cytoplasm has a reddish orangish kind of appearance to it. They're typically bilobed in terms of their nuclear shape. You can see the nucleus here looks kind of bilobed. They have that reddish orange appearance. And their number one biggest job is to respond to parasitic infections and to respond to allergic reactions. In the terms of parasites, remember, are multicellular organisms. They're made of hundreds of cells. So an individual eosinophil is not going to be able to consume this big old roundworm if it infects a body. But what eosinophils can do, and what they do, is they will line themselves up all around the periphery of a worm or other parasite, and then they begin to what's called degranulate. When I say degranulate, what I mean by that is those granules that are present in granulocytes, and that's true with neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils, those granules contain all kinds of toxic substances, toxic chemicals that can poison surrounding cells once they are released or degranulated or released from the eosinophil. So these eosinophils degranulate and they release all these toxic, harmful chemicals, things like bleach and other toxic substances. And what they try to do is basically poison that filarial worm, that roundworm, that parasite, whatever it is, poison it to death with all of these toxins they're throwing at it. Eosinophils account for a very small part of the total number of leukocytes. They're only around 2 to 4% of all the leukocytes found in blood. And again, as I said, their main roles are to respond to parasitic infections and allergic reactions. The least common of the leukocytes are the basophils. Basophils that have a cytoplasm with a relatively basic pH, so they take up that basic loving dye that has a bluish hue to it. So when we look under the microscope at basophils, they have a very dark purplish blue appearance to them. And the cytoplasm stains so darkly blue that oftentimes you cannot even see that there's a nucleus present. It just looks like an overall bluish purplish granulocyte with no nucleus. But there is a nucleus there. The nucleus is kind of bilobed. It looks a lot like an eosinophilic nucleus, but the cytoplasm is so darkly stained you cannot see it. As you can see here, basophils account for 1% or less of all of the white blood cells. They are pretty rare. You see them in higher concentration if somebody's having an infection with chickenpox and with certain other conditions like myxedema and diabetes mellitus. The big roles that basophils play is when they degranulate, they release histamine. Histamine is a chemical that's a great vasoconstrictor. And they also release, when they degranulate, they release heparin, which is an anticoagulant. It makes the blood very thin. Basophils are very similar to a type of cell found in connective tissue called mast cells. These basophils and mast cells are also implicated in responding to some types of allergic reactions, and they release large quantities of histamine. Well, that was a very fast overview of the different types of white blood cells. Now let's take a look at a couple of problems that can arise when I have abnormal white blood cells or abnormal numbers of white blood cells. Now, normally the count of white blood cells is somewhere between 5 and 10,000 per microliter or per cubic millimeter of blood. If a person has a lower than normal number of white blood cells. That condition is called leukopenia. Lots of things can cause a reduced white blood cell count. Sometimes heavy metal poisoning, like arsenic poisoning, can do it, mercury poisoning, lead poisoning. Sometimes, well, not sometimes, pretty much all the time, exposure to radiation, for example, during chemotherapy, can cause a reduction in the total number of white blood cells. In certain types of infections can also diminish white blood cell count. For example, HIV infection, the causative agent of AIDS, causes a reduction in the total number of white blood cells, in particular in the total number of lymphocytes. And some types of medications can also reduce the overall white blood cell count and cause leukopenia. On the opposite end of the spectrum is leukocytosis. That's when I have an abundance. I have more than the normal number of white blood cells. And this can be a normal response to infection. If I get a bacterial infection, for example, the total number of neutrophils present in the blood will skyrocket in response to that bacterial infection. If I have a severe allergic response, I'm going to have more eosinophils present. Sometimes if I'm just dehydrated, that means that the total number of white blood cells I have relative to the volume of blood plasma is greater. So I technically have leukocytosis. There's also some diseases like leukemia, which is cancer of white blood cells, which can induce a state of higher than normal red blood cell count or white blood cell count. Here's a slide of what it looks like when you see somebody with leukemia where they have a really high blood cell count. You can see that there's tons of monocytes in this picture, along with other types of white blood cells. Oftentimes, the types of white blood cells that we find in abundance or in lower than normal values can be highly informative to a physician. And so when blood is drawn, usually what's done on it as a matter of course is something called the differential white blood cell count. This is where a lab tech goes in and counts up how many neutrophils versus eosinophils versus monocytes, et cetera, that are seen. And then these are compared to normal values. And if we notice, for example, there's an elevation in the total number of eosinophils, then we might suspect a parasitic infection. If we notice more than the normal number of neutrophils, we might expect to see a bacterial infection. If there's more than the normal number of lymphocytes, well, maybe it's a virus that's the problem. Leukemia is a category all unto itself in terms of white blood cell problems. This is where some of the stem cells that give rise to white blood cells become cancerous. So we get cancer of hematopoietic tissue or blood-producing tissue. Usually these develop in the bone marrow, but they can develop in other places too, like lymph nodes. And so we start to get an overabundance in the production of lymphocytes, and oftentimes those lymphocytes are abnormal. So even though I may be making tons of monocytes, such as you see in this slide, the monocytes are not functional, they're abnormal. So this leads to some classic symptoms that there are three classic symptoms that occur with leukemia patients. They will have anemia and fatigue, they'll have bleeding disorders, and they oftentimes are susceptible to lots of different types of bacterial and viral infections. Here's why. With respect to anemia and fatigue, remember way back when I was talking about hematopoiesis, I told you that there was a precursor bone marrow stem cell that can give rise to red blood cells, to white blood cells, to megakaryocytes that give rise to platelets. Well, here's my stem cell, okay? And let's say it can give rise to red blood cells, it can give rise to white blood cells, it can give rise to those megakaryocytes that eventually lead to platelets. Well, if that stem cell starts to overproduce white blood cells because of some sort of genetic default, some sort of cancer formation, what that necessarily does is it takes away resources that could have been put into making red blood cells. And if I'm not making as many red blood cells as normal, we know that I can develop anemia. The fewer red blood cells I have, the less oxygen I have delivered to tissues, the more often I will feel fatigued just doing anything like walking down the street. So there's why we get anemia and fatigue with leukemia. Bleeding disorders occur because I'm again funneling all my energy into the manufacture of white blood cells at the expense of making megakaryocytes. And if I'm not making many megakaryocytes, I'm not making very many platelets. Therefore, my ability to clot blood is diminished because I don't have as many platelets around to help with that. So I get bleeding disorders. These people bleed very easily. They bruise very easily. That's the second classic sign of leukemia. Third one is lots of recurrent infections. That happens because, again, I've got these 5 types of white blood cells. If I'm putting all my effort into making one of those 5 types at the expense of the others, well, then I'm going to have a diminished total number of white blood cells. Now, some people might say, yeah, but you have an increased number of the one type of white blood cells, so you should be able to handle infections just fine. But remember, again, with leukemia, when I'm making an abundance of one white blood cell type, that type of blood cell is typically abnormal. It's not functioning the way it should be, even though it's there in record numbers. So as a result, all of the white blood cells are basically either there but non-functional, or they're there but they're in such low amounts that they really can't help fight off infection. As a result, these people oftentimes get bacterial and viral infections on a regular basis. Now, there are different types of leukemia. You can have leukemia that is derived from the myeloid stem cell line, or you can have leukemia that's derived from the lymphoid cell line. The myeloid cell line gives rise to neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So if your myeloid stem cell is the one that becomes cancerous, then you have an opportunity for the development of leukemia where you might see higher than normal numbers of neutrophils, or maybe you see higher than normal numbers of monocytes, for example. On the other hand, if it's the lymphoid stem cell line that becomes cancerous, then you're going to get an increase in the number of lymphocytes exclusively. This gives rise to terms such as a person having myeloid leukemia versus lymphoid leukemia. Okay, a person with myeloid leukemia obviously is either going to be making too many neutrophils or too many monocytes or too many eosinophils or too many basophils. People with lymphoid leukemia make too many lymphocytes. Leukemia can be acute or chronic. Acute means it has rapid onset and rapid progression. That means it develops very quickly, it appears very suddenly, and it can progress to death very rapidly. Chronic leukemias, on the other hand, may take years to develop. They can be developing really slowly. Maybe it takes as long as 3 years before you really start to develop those classic signs of leukemia, and they tend to progress pretty slowly. If you're going to get a leukemia, you want to have a chronic leukemia probably over an acute leukemia. In most cases, there are some exceptions. I'm not going to go into any more detail on subtypes of leukemia. I just want you to know about the difference between myeloid versus lymphoid and the difference between acute versus chronic. And you can have any combination of those. For example, I could have acute lymphoid leukemia. I could have chronic lymphocytic leukemia. I could have chronic myeloid leukemia. I could have acute myeloid leukemia.